For those who came in late. At the end of 2005, the FBI opened a new phase of its assault on earth and animal liberation movements with the arrests and indictments of several current and former activists. This offensive, dubbed Operation Backfire, was intended to obtain convictions for many of the unsolved Earth Liberation Front arsons of the preceding 10 years. Of those subpoenaed and charged, 8 ultimately cooperated with the government and informed on others in hopes of reduced sentences: Stanislaus Meyerhoff, Kevin Tubbs, Chelsea Dawn Gerlach, Suzanne Savoy, Kendall Tankersley, Jennifer Kolar, Lacey Philibom, and Darren Thurston. See sidebar. 4 held out through a terrifying year, during which it seemed certain they would end up serving decades in prison, until they were able to broker plea deals in which they could claim responsibility for their actions without providing information about others: Daniel McGowan, Jonathan Paul, Exile, aka Nathan Block, and Sadie, aka Joanna Zacher. As of this writing, Brianna Waters still waits to come to trial, while Joseph Dybee, Josephine Overacre, Rebecca Rubin, and Justin Solons have been charged but not found. One more defendant, William Rogers, aka Avalon, tragically passed away in an alleged suicide while in custody shortly after his arrest. The months following the launch of Operation Backfire saw an unprecedented increase in government repression of anarchist environmental activists, which came to be known as the Green Scare. Longtime animal liberation activist Rod Coronado was charged with a felony for answering a question during a speaking appearance, and faced potentially decades in prison. 6 animal rights activists associated with SHAC, the Campaign Against Animal Testing Corporation Huntington Life Sciences, were sentenced to several years in prison, essentially for running a website. Animal liberationist Peter Young, who had spent 7 years on the run from the FBI, had finally been captured and was being threatened with double jeopardy. Thierry Arrow, famous for surviving a 100-foot fall when police and loggers forced him out of a forest occupation, was fighting extradition from Canada to the United States to face arson charges. Innumerable people were subpoenaed to grand juries and some did jail time for refusing to cooperate. Perhaps most ominously of all, 3 young people were set up by an agent provocateur and arrested on conspiracy charges without having actually done anything at all. 2 of them, Zachary Jensen and Lauren Weiner, pled guilty and became government informants. The third, Eric McDavid, who has contracted life-threatening health problems as a consequence of being denied vegan food by his jailers, was recently found guilty and awaits sentencing. This phase of the Green Scare seems to be drawing to a close. Most of those apprehended in Operation Backfire are now serving their sentences. The first of the SHAC defendants has been released from prison. Peter Young has been out of prison for almost a year and is doing speaking tours. Rod Coronado's trial ended in a deadlock, and he took a plea in return for a short sentence when in theory, the task of a grand jury is to examine the validity of an accusation before trial. In practice, grand juries are used to force information out of people. By granting an individual immunity regarding a specific case, a grand jury can compel him or her to answer questions or else go to prison for contempt of court. Government threatened to bring further charges against him. It's been months now since a new high-profile felony case was brought against an environmental activist, though federal agents have been poking around in the Midwest. It's time to begin deriving lessons from the past 2 years of government repression, to equip the next generation that will take the front lines in the struggle to defend life on Earth. Distinguishing between perceived and real threats in some anarchist circles, the initial onset of the Green Scare was met with a panic that rivaled the response to the September 11th attacks. This, of course, was exactly what the government wanted. Quite apart from bringing individual activists to justice, they hope to intimidate all who see direct action as the most effective means of social change. Rather than aiding the government by making exaggerated assumptions about how dangerous it is to be an anarchist today, we must sort out what these cases show about the current capabilities and limits of government repression. The purpose of this inquiry is not to advocate or sensationalize any particular tactic or approach. We should be careful not to glorify illegal activity. It's important to note that most of even the staunchest non-cooperating defendants have expressed regrets about their choices, though this must be understood in the context of their court cases. At the same time, federal repression affects everyone involved in resistance, not just those who participate in illegal direct action. The Green Scare offers case studies of the situation we are all in, like it or not. The case of Darren Thurston. Government informant Darren Thurston recently released a lengthy statement presenting the history of Operation Backfire as he sees it and laying out what he apparently considers to be extenuating circumstances connected to his decision to inform. He insists that he does not condone snitching, and claims that he didn't share any information that was harmful to others. Unfortunately, as Thurston has chosen to withhold from the public both his plea agreement and the debrief documents that detail his cooperation with investigators, it's impossible to verify this claim. In contrast, non-cooperating Operation Backfire defendants have made their plea agreements public in their entirety. Thurston explains that he has not done the same because in his case the materials were not completely indicative of my cooperation and would be easily misunderstood by the majority of those who would hear about them. As his cooperation is already a matter of intense controversy, it could hardly make matters worse for him to follow the non-cooperating defendants' example. It's also worth noting that non-cooperating defendants, who have been allowed to view his plea agreement but are not allowed to speak about it, are urging people not to support him, presumably for good reason. At the conclusion of his statement, Thurston offers his closest comrades a limited apology for his decision to inform, admitting it set a bad example but placing responsibility for his choice on others' shoulders. Others cooperated first and made the case unwinnable. The government divided communities by spreading rumors. Activists abandoned and vilified the cooperating defendants before they'd even decided whether or not to cooperate, and so on. He also casts aspersions on non-cooperating defendants without ever specifying which ones he means. If this is not a matter of passive-aggressive self-justification but of serious concerns about their conduct, he owes it to the activist community to be more explicit. Thurston states that Operation Backfire defendants were facing guaranteed life sentences until they cooperated. In contrast to those who attribute the considerably shorter sentences the non-cooperating defendants received to the vigorous efforts of their defense teams, he credits his partner and fellow informant Chelsea Dawn Gerlach with helping to arrange merciful plea agreements for the non-cooperating defendants, an account that is sure to be controversial. He also mentions uncritically that by the time he and Gerlach were able to communicate after their arrests, she had already informed to the government not only about his involvement in the actions for which he was charged but also about a great deal of other illegal activity he had participated in. No doubt Thurston experienced a more frightening period of months following his arrest than most of us can possibly imagine. But this alone cannot justify a decision to inform. The fact that other defendants did not do the same shows that other options were possible. In his statement, he talks about healing our movements and making them stronger, but that can only occur on the foundation of a commitment to unconditionally and transparently refusing to inform on each other. Any supposed solidarity that does not proceed from this premise is a sham that will crumble beneath the first onslaught of government repression. Addressing the question of what constitutes acceptable conduct is not infighting and backstabbing, but an essential element of healing and strengthening our communities. As Thurston points out, we should not take the state at its word as to who is informing, but now that he has signed a sealed agreement to inform, the burden of proof is on him to show the limits of that informing. Those who read Thurston's statement should not take his analysis or any analysis, including this one, at face value, since the perspectives of everyone who comments on Operation Backfire are inevitably colored by their own motives. The question is which motives are most likely to facilitate a useful analysis. Thurston is in a difficult place, but there is still much he can do to facilitate the healing and strengthening of which he speaks. He can start by disclosing the full texts of his plea agreement and cooperation debriefing, and accepting complete personal accountability for his decision to inform. The state can do anything to us: isolate us, threaten us with life sentences, even, in some extremes, turn our loved ones against us. The only thing it cannot take from us, upon which any anti-authoritarian struggle must be founded, is the decision to abide by our principles come what may. Individual heroics cannot win a revolutionary struggle, only supportive communities can do that, but we can only form those communities by personally standing by our commitments, regardless of what others do. We can commend Thurston for the actions he once took in defense of animals and the environment, but the most important round of struggle takes place not in the streets but in the interrogation chamber. It is there, when the commitments and trust that form its backbone are put to the ultimate test, that a struggle lives or dies. Case study in Repression. Eugene, Oregon. Operation Backfire took place against a backdrop of government investigation, harassment, and profiling of presumed anarchists in the Pacific Northwest. It is no coincidence that Eugene, Oregon was a major focus of the Operation Backfire cases, as it has been a hotbed of dissent and radicalism over the past decade and a half, although repression and other problems have taken a toll in recent years. We can't offer a definitive analysis of the internal dynamics of the Eugene anarchist community, but we can look at how the authorities went about repressing it. One useful resource for this inquiry is Anarchist Direct Actions, A Challenge for Law Enforcement, an article that appeared in Studies in Conflict and Terrorism in 2005, authored by Randy Borum of the University of South Florida and Chuck Tilby of the Eugene Police Department. According to Jeff Free Luers, Tilby was one of the cops who surveilled Free and his co-defendant Critter on the night of their arrest in June 2000. Tilby has given presentations on the criminal anarchist movement to law enforcement groups, and was intimately involved in the Operation Backfire cases, even making statements to the media and providing a quote to the FBI press release at the end of the Oregon federal prosecution. Surprisingly, the article does not explicitly reference Eugene, Oregon at all. Besides Tilby's byline at the beginning, there's no indication that the paper was written from Eugene. All the same, the article provides several important clues about how the government proceeded against the Oregon defendants and those who were perceived to support them. The authors centralize the importance of intelligence and informants for repressing criminal anarchists, while acknowledging the difficulty of obtaining them. In the case of grand jury subpoenas, anarchists regularly fail to comply, and support groups are often set up for those targeted. One of the more recent examples of this was Jeff Hogg, who received a grand jury subpoena while the Backfire prosecutions were underway and was jailed for nearly 6 months in 2006 as a result. The authors warn that investigators and law enforcement officers should be cautious during questioning not to divulge more to the subject about the case, via questions, than is learned through their testimony. Indeed, questions asked by grand juries turned up more than once in the pages of the Earth First Journal, which was edited from Eugene for a time. It is extremely important to support those under investigation and keep abreast of investigators' efforts. Some believe that the Backfire investigation only arrived at a position of real strength once such support started to weaken in Oregon. Regarding infiltration, Anarchist Direct Actions advises that infiltration is made more difficult by the communal nature of the anarchist lifestyle, under constant observation and scrutiny, and the extensive knowledge held by many anarchists, which require a considerable amount of study and time to acquire. Other strategies for infiltration have been explored, but so far have not been successful. Discussion of these theories in an open paper is not advisable. What we know of the early Backfire investigation points to a strategy of generalized monitoring and infiltration. While investigators used increasingly focused tools and strategies as the investigation gained steam, for example, sending cooperating witnesses wearing body wires to talk to specific targets, they started out by sifting through a whole demographic of countercultural types. Activist and punk houses as well as gathering spots such as bars were placed under surveillance. Anarchists who drink should be careful about the way alcohol can loosen lips. Infiltrators and informants targeted not only the most visibly committed anarchists, but also bohemians who inhabited similar cultural and social spheres. Police accumulated tremendous amounts of background information even while failing to penetrate the circles in which direct action was organized. The approximately 30,000 pages of discovery in the Oregon cases contain a vast amount of gossip and background information on quite a few from the Eugene community. A similar profiling methodology appears to have been used in nearby Portland, Oregon. In March 2001, for example, a large-scale police raid was carried out on a house party attended by Portland punk rockers. The attendees were photographed and questioned about the Earth and animal liberation fronts. Some were arrested and charged with kidnapping and assault on an officer, a standard overcharging which eventually led to plea deals. The defendants from the raid were videotaped at their court appearances by officers later identified as Gang Enforcement Unit members. In the aftermath of this raid, cops routinely harassed punks on the street, demanding to be told whether they were anarchists. In retrospect, it seems likely that such efforts were not meant simply to intimidate Portland's punks, but to uncover information relevant to the anarchist and ALF/ELF cases of the time. This may have been a wrong step in the backfire investigation. Right now there's no way to know. We do for information on this incident in Portland. See Christian Williams, The Criminalization of Anarchism, Part 2, Guilt by Association, Questionable Confessions and Mandatory Minimums, reprinted in Confrontations, Selected Journalism by Tarantula Publications. Know, however, that wide-net approaches by the state can be effective at stifling socially aware subcultures, even when they uncover no real links to radical action. Fortunately, in Portland those affected by the raid came together in response, aiding each other, limiting the damage done, and taking advantage of the situation to draw attention to police activity. Another point of speculation is the degree to which authorities fostered division and infighting within radical circles in Eugene. This was a common COINTELPRO tactic, and is probably still in use. Borum and Tilby hint at this in the final section of their paper, Law Enforcement Strategies/Implications. Internal conflicts are another major source of vulnerability within the movement. The diversity of tactics debate has already been addressed, but the movement also is struggling with a perceived lack of power among women, and the lack of the FBI's counterintelligence program. COINTELPRO existed officially from 1956 to 1971 and probably continues to this day in some form. Aiming to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of groups like the Black Panther Party, the program utilized a wide variety of dirty tricks. Houses and offices were searched and documents stolen without any warrants having been issued. Rumors were spread in order to foster mistrust and even violence between different organizations or factions within them. Group members were harassed through the courts or even wholly framed for crimes they did not commit. Infiltrators and agent provocateurs were distributed within target constituencies. No act of psychological warfare or blatant violence was ruled out. The program was finally exposed when radicals broke into an FBI office and seized documents relating to the secret program, circulating them to various sources under the name of the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. Inclusion of ethnic minorities. This kind of conflict occurred 3 decades ago within the leftist revolutionary movement in the United States. For those familiar with Eugene radical circles, this brings to mind the heated conflicts over gender and feminism within that community. There is no concrete evidence that government operatives were involved in escalating such debates, and we should be careful not to jump to conclusions. Such speculation can only assist the state by propagating paranoia. However, law enforcement from local to federal levels must have been aware of the vulnerabilities that opened up when real debates turned to groupthink and factionalism in Eugene. Tilby and his cohorts must have used such insights to their advantage as they devised anti-anarchist strategies. By the time Operation Backfire grand juries began following up on real leads in Eugene, many who could have come together to oppose them were no longer on speaking terms. While this does not justify the lack of integrity shown by those who assisted grand juries, it does offer some context for why the grand juries weren't resisted more effectively. Borum and Tilby close their paper by urging investigators to display patience and persistence, and indeed, patience and persistence ultimately paid off in Operation Backfire. This is not to lend credibility to the notion that the FBI always get their man. The investigation was riddled with errors and missteps. Plenty of other actions will never be prosecuted, as the authorities got neither lucky breaks nor useful cooperation. But we must understand that repression, and resistance to it, are both long-term projects, stretching across years and decades. According to some accounts, one of the most significant leads in Operation Backfire came from a naive request for police reports at a Eugene police station. According to this version, the police deduced from this request that they should pay attention to Jacob Ferguson. Ferguson later became the major informant in these cases. It is less frequently mentioned that the police were accusing Ferguson of an arson he did not participate in. With Ferguson, the unlikely happened and it paid off for the authorities to be wrong. Later on, when agents made their first arrests and presented grand jury subpoenas on December 7, 2005, 2 of those subpoenaed were wrongly assumed to have been involved in attacks. Their subpoenas were eventually dropped, as the authorities gained the cooperation of more informants and eventually made moves to arrest Exile and Sadie instead. The investigation was not as unstoppable and dynamic as the government would like us to think, although the prosecution gathered force as more individuals rolled on others. The authorities spent years stumbling around, and they continued to falter even when prosecution efforts were underway, but they were tenacious and kept at their efforts. Meanwhile, radical momentum was less consistent. Let's review the arc of radical activity in Eugene over the past decade. The anti-capitalist riot of June 18, 1999 in Eugene led to jubilation on the part of anarchists, even if one participant spent 7 years in prison as a result. The participants in the June 18 Day of Action had put up a fight and fucked up some symbols of misery in the town, catching the police unprepared. The pitched battles on the streets of Seattle later that year at the WDO meeting only reinforced the feeling that the whole world was up for grabs. Most of the active anarchists in Eugene had never lived through such a period before. Despite the paltry demands and muddled analysis of much of the official anti-globalization movement, there was a sense that deeper change could be fought for and won. Being an anarchist seemed like the coolest thing you could be, and this perception was magnified by the media attention that followed. The ELF was setting fires all over the region at the time. A series of reversals followed. In June 2001, Free received his initial sentence of 22 years and 8 months. The following month, Carlo Giuliani was murdered on the streets of Genoa during protests against the G8 summit in Italy. While both of these tragedies illustrated the risks of confronting the capitalist system, Free's sentence hit home especially hard in Eugene. In the changed atmosphere, some began dropping away and getting on with their lives, not necessarily betraying their earlier principles, but shifting their focus and priorities. This attrition intensified when American flags appeared everywhere in the aftermath of September 11, 2001. Anarchist efforts did not cease, but a period of relative disorientation followed. A year and a half later, the invasion of Iraq provided another opportunity for radicals to mobilize, but some consistency had been lost in the Eugene area. And all the while, FBI employees and police kept their regular hours, day in and day out. Law enforcement received its most significant breakthrough in the Backfire cases, even though it started as an incorrect hypothesis just before Free's sentencing, in the period between anarchist jubilation and the shift to the defensive. The same fires that were incorrectly linked to Ferguson were used to justify Free's stiff sentence, which intimidated some anarchists out of action. There was not enough revaluation, learning, and sharpening of skills, nor enough efforts at conflict resolution. The retreat occurred by default. What would have happened if the Backfire investigation had continued under different circumstances, while radicals maintained their momentum? That would be another story. Its conclusion is unknown. Putting up a fight. Repression will exist as long as there are states and people who oppose them. Complete invulnerability is impossible, for governments as well as their opponents. All the infiltrators and informants of the Tsarist secret police were powerless to prevent the Russian Revolution of 1917, just as the East German Stasi were unable to prevent the fall of the Berlin Wall even though they had files on 6 million people. Revolutionary struggles can succeed even in the face of massive repression. For our part, we can minimize the effects of that repression by preparing in advance. For many years now anarchists have focused on developing security culture, but security consciousness alone is not enough. There are some points one can never emphasize too much. Don't gossip about sensitive matters, share delicate information on a need-to-know basis *. Don't surrender your rights if detained or arrested, don't cooperate with grand juries, don't sell other people out. But one can abide by all these dictums and still make crucial mistakes. If anti-repression strategies center only on what we should not talk about, we lose sight of the necessity of clear communication for communities in struggle. It does appear that Operation Backfire defendants could have done better at limiting the flow of information inside their circles. Rather than organizing in closed, consistent cells, the defendants seem to have worked in more fluid arrangements, with enough crossover that once a few key participants turned informant, the government had information about everyone. State disruption of radical movements can be interpreted as a kind of armed critique, in the way that someone throwing a brick through a Starbucks window is a critique in action. That is to say, a successful use of force against us demonstrates that we had pre-existing vulnerabilities. This is not to argue that we should blame the victim in situations of repression, but we need to learn how and why efforts to destabilize our activities succeed. Our response should not start with jail support once someone has been arrested. Of course, this is important, along with longer-term support of those serving sentences, but our efforts must begin long before, countering the small vulnerabilities that our enemy can exploit. Open discussion of problems, for example, gender roles being imposed in nominally radical spaces, can protect against unhealthy resentments and schisms. This is not to say that every split is unwarranted. Sometimes the best thing is for people to go their separate ways, but that even if that is necessary, they should try to maintain mutual respect, or at least a willingness to communicate when it counts. Risk is relative. In some cases, it may indeed be a good idea to lay low. In other cases, maintaining public visibility is viewed as too risky, when in fact nothing could be more dangerous than withdrawing from the public eye and letting momentum die. When we think about risk, we often picture security cameras and prison cells, but there are many more insidious threats. The Operation Backfire defendants ended up with much shorter sentences than expected. As it turned out, the most serious risk they faced was not prison time, after all, but recantation and betrayal, a risk that proved all too real. Likewise, we can imagine Eric McDavid, who currently awaits sentencing on conspiracy charges, idly discussing the risk factor of a hypothetical action with his supposed friends, who turned out to be two potential informants and a federal agent provocateur. Unfortunately, the really risky thing was having those discussions with those people in the first place. Preparing for the worst. Conventional activist wisdom dictates that one must not mix public and clandestine activity, but Daniel McGowan's case seems to contradict this. McGowan was not brought to trial as a result of investigations based on his public organizing, but rather because he had worked with Jacob Ferguson, who turned snitch under police pressure. Though the government was especially eager to convict him on account of his extensive prisoner support work and organizing against the Republican National Convention, McGowan received tremendous public support precisely because he had been so visible. Had he simply hidden in obscurity, he might have ended up in the same situation without the support that enabled him to weather it as successfully as he did, and without making as many important contributions to the anarchist movement. Considering how many years it took the FBI to put together Operation Backfire and the prominent role of informants in so many Green Scare cases, it seems like it is possible to get away with a lot, provided you are careful and make intelligent decisions about who to trust. McGowan's direct action resume, as it appears in the government arguments at his sentencing, see Appendix, reads like something out of an adventure novel. One can't help but think just 7 years, for all that. The other side of this coin is that, despite all their precautions, the Green Scare defendants did get caught. No matter how careful and intelligent you are, it doesn't pay to count on not getting caught. You have to be prepared for the worst. Those who are considering risky direct action should start from the assumption that they will be caught and prosecuted. Before doing anything, before even talking about it, they should ask themselves whether they could accept the worst possible consequences. At the same time, as the government may target anyone at any time regardless of what they have actually done, it is important for even the most law-abiding activists not to mention their friends and relatives to think through how to handle being investigated, subpoenaed, or charged. The Green Scare cases show that cooperating with the government is never in a defendant's best interest. On average, the non-cooperating defendants in Operation Backfire are actually serving less time in proportion to their original threatened sentences than the informants. See chart. Despite the government engaging the entire repressive apparatus of the United States to make an example of them. Exile and Sadie were threatened with over 1,000 years in prison apiece, and are serving less than 8. If every arrestee understood the difference between what the state threatens and what it can actually do, far fewer would give up without a fight. In the United States legal system, a court case is essentially a game of chicken. The state starts by threatening the worst penalties it possibly can, in hopes of intimidating the defendant into pleading guilty and informing. It is easier if the defendant pleads guilty immediately. This saves the state immense quantities of time and money, not to mention the potential embarrassment of losing a well-publicized trial. Defendants should not be intimidated by the initial charges brought against them. It often turns out that many of these will not hold up, and are only being pressed to give the state more bargaining power. Even if a defendant fears he won't have a leg to stand on in court, he can obtain some bargaining power of his own by threatening to put the state through a costly, challenging, and unpredictable trial. To that end, it is essential to acquire the best possible legal representation. When a defendant agrees to cooperate, he loses all that leverage, throwing himself at the mercy of forces that don't have an ounce of mercy to offer. As grim as things looked for Sadie, Exile, McGowan, and Jonathan Paul through most of 2006, they looked up when McGowan's lawyer demanded information about whether prosecutors had used illegal National Security Agency wiretaps to gather evidence against the defendants. The government was loath to answer this question, and for good reason. There had just been a public scandal about NSA wiretaps, and if the court found that wiretaps had been used unconstitutionally, the entire Operation Backfire case would have been thrown out. That's exactly why so many members of the Weather Underground are professors today rather than convicts. The FBI botched that case so badly the courts had to let them go free. No matter how hopeless things look, never underestimate the power of fighting it out. Until Stanislaus Meyerhoff and others capitulated, the linchpin of the federal case in Operation Backfire was Jacob Ferguson, a heroin addict and serial arsonist. Had all besides Ferguson refused to cooperate and instead fought the charges together, Operation Backfire would surely have ended differently. On informants. If becoming an informant is always a bad idea, why do so many people do it? At least 11 high-profile defendants in Green Scare cases have chosen to cooperate with the government against their former comrades, not including Peter Young's partner, who informed on him back in 1999. These were all experienced activists who presumably had spent years considering how they would handle the pressure of interrogation and trial, who must have been familiar with all the reasons it doesn't pay to cooperate with the state. What, if anything, can we conclude from how many of them became informants? There has been quite a bit of opportunist speculation on this subject by pundits with little knowledge of the circumstances and even less personal experience. We are to take it for granted that arrestees became informants because they were privileged middle-class kids. In fact, both the cooperating and non-cooperating defendants are split along class and gender lines. We are told that defendants snitched because they hadn't been fighting for their own interests. What exactly are one's own interests, if not to live in a world without slaughterhouses and global warming? Cheaper hamburgers and air conditioning, perhaps? It has even been suggested that it's inevitable some will turn informant under pressure, so we must not blame those who do, and instead should avoid using tactics that provoke investigations and interrogations. This last aspersion is not worth dignifying with a response, except to point out that no crime need be committed for the government to initiate investigations and interrogations. Whether or not you support direct action of any kind, it is never acceptable to equip the state to do harm to other human beings. Experienced radicals who have been snitched on themselves will tell you that there is no surefire formula for determining who will turn informant and who won't. There have been informants in almost every resistance movement in living memory, including the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army, the American Indian Movement, and the Puerto Rican Independence Movement. The Green Scare cases are not particularly unusual in this regard, though some of the defendants seem to have caved in more swiftly than their antecedents. It may be that the hullabaloo about how many eco-activists have turned informant is partly due to commentators' ignorance of past struggles. If anything discourages people from informing on each other, it is blood ties. Historically, the movements with the least snitching have been the ones most firmly grounded in long-standing communities. Arrestees in the national liberation movements of yesteryear didn't cooperate because they wouldn't be able to face their parents or children again if they did. Likewise, when gangsters involved in illegal capitalist activity refuse to inform, it is because doing so would affect the entirety of their lives, from their prospects in their chosen careers to their social standing in prison as well as their neighborhoods. The stronger the ties that bind an individual to a community, the less likely it is he or she will inform against it. North American radicals from predominantly white demographics have always faced a difficult challenge in this regard, as most of the participants are involved in defiance of their families and social circles rather than because of them. When an ex-activist is facing potentially decades in prison for something that was essentially a hobby, with his parents begging him not to throw his life away and the system he fought against apparently dominating the entirety of his present and future, it takes a powerful sense of right and wrong to resist selling out. In this light, it isn't surprising that the one common thread that links the non-cooperating defendants is that practically all of them were still involved in either anarchist or at least counter-cultural communities. Daniel McGowan was ceaselessly active in many kinds of organizing right up to his arrest. Exile and Sadie were still committed to life against the grain, if not political activity. A witness who attended their sentencing described their supporters as an otherworldly troupe of black metal fans with braided beards and facial piercings. Here we see again the necessity of forging powerful, long-term communities with a shared culture of resistance. Dropouts must do this from scratch, swimming against the tide, but it is not impossible. Healthy relationships are the backbone of such communities, not to mention secure direct action organizing. Again, unaddressed conflicts and resentments, unbalanced power dynamics, and lack of trust have been the Achilles heel of countless groups. The FBI keeps psychological profiles on its targets, with which to prey on their weaknesses and exploit potential interpersonal fissures. The oldest trick in the book is to tell arrestees that their comrades already snitched on them. To weather this intimidation, people must have no doubts about their comrades' reliability. Snitches get stitches posters notwithstanding, anarchists aren't situated to enforce a no-informing code by violent means. It's doubtful that we could do such a thing without compromising our principles. Anyway, when it comes to coercion and fear, the state can always outdo us, and we shouldn't aspire to compete with it. Instead, we should focus on demystifying snitching and building up the collective trust and power that discourage it. If being a part of the anarchist community is rewarding enough, no one will wish to exile themselves from it by turning informant. For this to work, of course, those who do inform on others must be excluded from our communities with absolute finality. In betraying others for personal advantage, they join the ranks of the police officers, prison guards, and executioners they assist. Those who may participate in direct action together should first take time to get to know each other well, including each other's families and friends, and to talk over their expectations, needs, and goals. You should know someone long enough to know what you like least about him or her before committing to secure activity together. You have to be certain you'll be able to work through the most difficult conflicts and trust them in the most frightening situations up to a full decade later. Judging from the lessons of the 1970s, drug addiction is another factor that tends to correlate with snitching, as it can be linked to deep-rooted personal problems. Indeed, Jacob Ferguson, the first informant in Operation Backfire, was a longtime heroin addict. Just as the Operation Backfire cases would have been a great deal more difficult for the government if no one besides Jake had cooperated, the FBI might never have been able to initiate the cases at all if others had not trusted Jake in the first place. Prompt prisoner support is as important as public support for those facing grand juries. As one Green Scare defendant has pointed out, defendants often turn informant soon after arrest when they are off balance and uncertain what lies ahead. Jail is notorious for being a harsher environment than prison. Recent arrestees may be asking themselves whether they can handle years of incarceration without a realistic sense of what that would entail. Supporters should bail defendants out of jail as quickly as possible, so they can be informed and level-headed as they make decisions about their defense strategy. To this end, it is ideal if funds are earmarked for legal support long before any arrests occur. It cannot be emphasized enough that informing is always a serious matter, whether it is a question of a high-profile defendant snitching on his comrades or an acquaintance of law-abiding activists answering seemingly harmless questions. The primary goal of the government in any political case is not to put any one defendant in prison but to obtain information with which to map radical communities, with the ultimate goal of repressing and controlling those communities. The first deal the government offered Peter Young was for him to return to animal rights circles to report to them from within, not just on illegal activity, but on all activity. The most minor piece of trivia may serve to jeopardize a person's life, whether or not they have ever broken any law. It is never acceptable to give information about any other person without his or her express consent. Regaining the initiative. We must not conceptualize our response to government repression in purely reactive terms. It takes a lot of resources for the government to mount a massive operation like the Green Scare cases, and in doing so they create unforeseen situations and open up new vulnerabilities. Like in judo, when the state makes a move, we can strike back with a counter-move that catches them off balance. To take an example from mass mobilizations, the powers that be were eventually able to cripple the so-called anti-globalization movement by throwing tremendous numbers of police at it, but in the wake of lawsuits subsequently brought against them, the police in places like Washington, D.C. now have their hands tied when it comes to crowd control, as demonstrated by their extreme restraint at the IMF/World Bank protests in October 2007. We're in a long war with hierarchical power that cannot be won or lost in any single engagement. The question is always how to make the best of each development, seizing the initiative whenever we can and passing whatever gains we make on to those who will fight after us. There must be a way to turn the legacy of the Green Scare to our advantage. One starting place is to use it as an opportunity to learn how the state investigates underground activity and make sure those lessons are shared with the next generation. Another is to find common cause with other targeted communities. A promising example of this is the recent connection between animal liberation activists in the Bay Area and supporters of the San Francisco 8 ex-Black Panthers who are now being charged with the 1971 murder of a police officer. Appendix. Report from Daniel McGowan's sentencing hearing, June 4, 2007. A summary of Assistant U.S. Attorney Stephen Pfeiffer's presentation of the government's case against Daniel McGowan, by Gumby Cascadia. Pfeiffer began by stating that Daniel McGowan was pleading guilty to one count of conspiracy and arson charges related to actions at Superior Lumber in Glendale, Oregon, and Jefferson Poplar Farm in Clatskanie, Oregon, and that his aliases had included Dylan K., Jamie Moran, Sorrel, Jenny, Rabbit, Agent Tart Classique, and Agent Key Lime. Pfeiffer said he has had lengthy involvement with many underground groups, including the Biotic Baking Brigade, BBB, California Croppers, Cropotistas, Reclaim the Seeds, Washington Tree Improvement Association, and Anarchist Golfers Association. Although many CO defendants in this case have said in court that they had never used the name the family. Asterisk. Pfeiffer said McGowan used it often and repeatedly. Daniel, he said, was two different people, the one his family and friends knew, and his underground persona. He characterized Daniel as having a Jekyll and Hyde personality. He said that, like Kevin Tubbs who committed his first arson solo, in 1997 Daniel acted alone, breaking windows and spray painting Alf at a Macy's in Brooklyn that sold furs, at Zamir Furs in Brooklyn, and at a business called Evolution that sold parts of endangered animals. In 1998, Daniel moved to San Francisco where he met Suzanne Savoy. In November of that year, he threw a pie in the face of the Sierra Club president. Pfeiffer said this was more than a symbolic act, and that by this time, Daniel had given up on mainstream environmentalism. That same month, Daniel pied the CEO of Novartis Seeds and the Dean of Natural Resources at UC Berkeley. The communiques attribute the acts to the Biotic Baking Brigade. Pfeiffer said that Daniel was associated with the group as late as 2004. The same year, Daniel targeted Fidelity Investments, for their investment in Occidental Petroleum, by throwing glass etching solution on their windows. In December, there was a power outage in San Francisco, and Pfeiffer stated that Daniel took advantage of the opportunity to target the Bank of America with paint-filled balloons, apparently just because it was a financial institution. In July 1999, Daniel performed reconnaissance at a UC Berkeley plant research facility. He drew a diagram of the genetically engineered corn crop, which was then used by others to tear the crops up. Daniel was not there, Pfeiffer said, because he was busy in Lodi, California with a group calling themselves the Lodi Loppers, destroying GE corn owned by Eureka Seeds. The communique for the action was written by Daniel. The same year, Daniel was involved in another action against genetic engineering with a group called Reclaim the Seeds. Near the end of 1999, Daniel moved to Seattle to begin preparing for the WDO ministerial but, according to Pfeiffer, his work lived on in a zine called The Nighttime Gardener, posted on the Bioengineering Action Network's website. Pfeiffer said it was similar to the how-to guides written by Bill Rogers, with instructions on how to attack research facilities and destroy years of researchers' work. While living in Seattle, Daniel and Suzanne Savoy traveled to Pullman, Washington to target a potato research facility, but the action was called off due to a vehicle breakdown. In November, 3 days before the WDO battle, there were attacks at 2 GE crop sites in Puyallup, Washington and at the University of Washington, which Pfeiffer called prophetic. Daniel wasn't there because he was sick and denied writing the communique, but said that parts of it appeared to be based on his research. The communique references Toby Bradshaw, whose office was later targeted during the double whammy arson at the University of Washington. From November 30 through December 2, the World Trade Organization met or tried to in Seattle. Pfeiffer said Daniel was an integral part of the property destruction carried out by the Black Bloc. He said Seattle was understaffed by police who had their hands full dealing with nonviolent legal protesters. He referred to a planned action at Cargill that he said was called off because the team didn't want to tangle with longshoremen at the site. McGowan changed his plans and rampaged through the streets instead, Pfeiffer said, using a tire iron to smash windows. McGowan favored the use of a slingshot with ball bearings, which sounds as dangerous as it is. In 2000, Daniel moved to Eugene, where he was invited to attend his first book club meeting *, but he didn't go to that one. By that time, he was a trusted member of the family, otherwise he would not have been invited, said Pfeiffer. Daniel committed acts of vandalism around Eugene at Umpqua Bank and at a health food store, according to Pfeiffer. For a short time, Daniel worked for the Earth First Journal, which was not radical or extreme enough for him, according to Pfeiffer, who quoted a line from a letter to the journal from Rabid that read, "If Earth First won't support the ELF, who will?" In June of 2000 with Savoy, Daniel targeted the Pure Seed Testing Company in Kenby, Oregon, destroying their greenhouses and test plots and causing $500,000 in damage. The communique released by the Anarchist Golfers Association was full of McGowan's well-known humor and ridicule, according to Pfeiffer. The communique blamed the U.S. Forest Service and APHIS for their role in biological destruction, which Pfeiffer said was another example of how Daniel has targeted government agencies and private facilities over and over again to intimidate, coerce, and retaliate. The following month, Daniel traveled to the Midwest to work with an entirely different cell. Pfeiffer said that the plea agreement does not require Daniel to name names, but that the Midwest group is an entirely different cell of people and that Daniel is protecting them and thwarting their investigation by refusing to name them, not that there haven't been leads, he said. While in the Midwest, Daniel researched and carried out an attack on the U.S. Forest Service Biotechnology Laboratory in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, which Pfeiffer said was looking for alternative ways to create wood pulp to save trees. Over $1 million in damage was done, and Daniel wrote the communique. In September, Daniel attended the book club meeting in Santa Cruz, where he lectured to the others about actions against genetic engineering. That December, Daniel performed a recon mission at Jefferson Poplar, which was a large and challenging target, so the action was put off, and instead, Superior lumber was targeted. Daniel reconnoitered the site a week before the arson, and moved into a nearby house solely to prepare. He lived with the devices and fuel and, on the night of the action, helped load the vehicle and rode with the crew, changed into dark clothing, checked the radios, and acted as lookout while the others set the devices that caused over $1 million damage. After the action, Daniel and Savoy went to Portland and used a public computer to write the communique. Pfeiffer said Daniel went into the bathroom at Powell's Books to assemble the communique, almost like Mission Impossible. In January of 2001, Daniel attended his second book club meeting in Olympia, prior to the Double Whammy and Romania fires. In March, Daniel played a major role in the tree spiking of the Judy timber sale. Pfeiffer said Daniel researched tree spiking, so he knew about the danger to loggers and mill workers, that he purchased the nails and spikes, and that he personally recruited others. They worked for 2.5 hours, wearing headlamps like miners, and spiked the trees high and low, cutting off the ends of some so that loggers would not see the nails. Daniel wrote the communique, which stated that, all responsibility for worker safety now lies with the owner of the sale, Seneca Jones Corporation, and their accomplices, the Forest Service. Cancel this sale immediately. Pfeiffer said that Daniel's actions were callous and reckless, and that tree spiking was renounced by Judy Bari * before Redwood Summer. Daniel was not involved in the Romania arson, but Meyerhoff came to Daniel to approve the communique. Daniel was concerned that the communique mentioned Free and Critter, but was unable to sway the group to change it. Originally, the action at Jefferson Poplar was supposed to be simply destroying the trees as with other GE actions Daniel had participated in, but this was ratcheted up to arson. Daniel knew about the other half of the double whammy. Pfeiffer called it a well-planned and coordinated crime. Daniel helped purchase the needed supplies and took part in the construction of the devices wearing a Tyvek clean suit and gloves. He set the devices in the office and garage using trailers of bed sheets soaked in fuel to link the vehicles together, and spray-painted ELF on the unburned building. Regarding the placement of a device near a propane tank, Pfeiffer said Daniel and Meyerhoff had a brief discussion about it and that Daniel expressed concern, but ultimately it was still left there. Gerlach and Daniel wrote the communique, which was out to get the government, according to Pfeiffer. Pfeiffer spoke again about how there had been a disagreement, involving Craig Roseborough about alterations made to the communique, and that Roseborough lost his job over it, which illustrates Daniel's depth of involvement in the movement. Pfeiffer showed an overhead projection of the Spirit of Freedom newsletter from June/July of '01, which Daniel published as part of the North American Earth Liberation Prisoner Support Network he established and ran, that contained an article entitled Fascist Legislation in the Works about laws being passed in Oregon and Washington targeting direct action activists. Pfeiffer used the exhibit to show that Daniel had an interest in influencing government and should have the terrorism enhancement applied in the Jefferson Poplar fire. He said, "For years, McGowan has been targeting government and private facilities." At Daniel's third book club meeting, held in Sisters, Oregon, the altered communique was discussed, as was the possible dissolution of the family. On June 18 of 2001, Daniel damaged logging equipment totaling $22,000, and in July he dug up and damaged culverts at a timber sale in Oregon. Following that action, he went to Canada, and tries to make it look innocent, says Pfeiffer, but grand juries were being convened in Eugene and people subpoenaed, so Daniel left to avoid getting arrested. He returned to Eugene briefly before moving back to New York. Pfeiffer made the Jekyll and Hyde illusion again, saying that during his time back in New York, Daniel engaged in legitimate activism while remaining sympathetic to direct action tactics. As for Daniel's prisoner support work, Pfeiffer said he was only willing to support those who had not cooperated with law enforcement and that his current support is filled with like-minded people. On January 20, 2004, Daniel stood by while someone tossed a pie into the face of Randall Terry, founder of right-wing nut pro-life wackos Operation Rescue. Stenographer's wording, not Pfeiffer's, but the following are Pfeiffer's words: "Apparently free speech and lawful protest only go so far with Mr. McGowan. Daniel wrote the communiqué, which was signed Agent Key Lime. Also in 2004, Daniel was a key organizer for the RNC Not Welcome website designed to make conventioneers feel unwelcome in his hometown. Pfeiffer showed articles from the New York Times and Salon.com in which Daniel, going by the name Jamie Moran, disavows violence against people, but not property. Pfeiffer said Daniel was directing his cadre of anarchists, dogging delegates, and trying to make Republicans' lives as miserable as possible. Pfeiffer then played excerpts of the recorded conversations Daniel had with the wired double entendre intended Jake Ferguson. In the recordings, captured when Ferguson visited Daniel in New York in April of 2005 and again when Daniel visited Eugene in August that year, they discuss whether the actions had any lasting effect. Daniel said he felt the actions had been a powerful symbol, even though most of the targets had been rebuilt. He referred to Veil** as a recruitment drive, and expressed that he felt the actions had been successful in changing public perception. Daniel also expressed concern about others in the cell turning on each other, and said that if any of them were ever captured, he would find the money to hire the best lawyer available for that person. He said the only reasons he felt anyone would talk were if they found Jesus, went insane, or if they wanted money, to which Jake jumped in and said, "Money? What do you mean?" and to which Daniel replied, "That's some Judas shit, man." Daniel spoke about Free's case and talked about hiring a private investigator to reveal a personal friendship between Lyle Velour, the judge from Free's case, and the Steve Romania family, owners of the SUV lot Free targeted. He also spoke about putting Velour's address and phone number on a website, although he never did it. Then Daniel talked about finding a copy of Bill Rogers setting fires with electrical timers, making clean copies, and sending them to some distributors in hopes they would be circulated. While Ferguson drove Daniel to the airport, they passed a Seneca sawmill, owners of a company Daniel remembered as linked to the Superior Lumber Company but that was actually connected to the Judy sale, laughed and said "Happy fucking New Year," i.e. referring to the New Year arson at Superior Lumber. Pfeiffer said the comment showed Daniel's attitude. He said that, if Nathan and Joanna plead out because they had to, that Daniel's goose was cooked by those tapes. In them, he recounts all his major criminal acts and reveals his attitude toward the law. Pfeiffer then quoted Emerson, "Commit a crime, and the earth is made of glass. Right now, Your Honor, Daniel McGowan's world is made of glass." He said the government is seeking 92-month sentence postscript. "Cowards and heroes, I find it ironic that you support victimized women, yet in your communiques you verbally victimize those with whom you disagree. I wonder if you ever called scholars in the Northwest about how to be effective and take positive action. Like the professors who wrote letters to the court on your behalf, most professors are incredibly generous with their ideas. I've learned a lot in my years on the bench, seen it all. It's called the human experience. Take off the masks until the real Daniel McGowan is revealed, be the change you truly want to be. Don't use Gandhi just when it's convenient. I hope you'll go back to your website and tell who you were, what you did. You may not be as popular, but, change your website. Denounce, renounce, and condemn. If you really mean it, it shouldn't be hard. To the young people, send the message that violence doesn't work. If you want to make a difference, have the courage to say how the life you lived was the life of a coward. It is a tragedy to watch these extremely talented and bright young people come in and do damage to industries. It's not okay to put people in fear doing what they need to do to survive. Take off the hoods, sweatshirts, and masks and have a real dialogue." Judge Aiken, in sentencing Daniel McGowan to 7 years in prison with a terrorism enhancement, notes taken by Gumby Cascadia, in reflecting on Judge Aiken's sentencing, "Let us put aside, for the time being, the question of whether executives who profit from logging, animal exploitation, and genetic engineering are doing what they need to do to survive. Let's allow to pass, as well, the suggestion that those who run these industries are more likely to enter into a real dialogue with environmentalists if the latter limit themselves to purely legal activity. Let's even reserve judgment on Aiken's attempt to draw parallels between domestic violence and sarcastic communiques, which parallels the prosecutor's assertion that the elf, despite having never injured a single human being, is no different from the Ku Klux Klan. There is but one question we cannot help but ask, in reference to Judge Aiken's rhetoric about cowardice: if she found herself in a situation that called for action to be taken outside the established channels of the legal system, would she be capable of it? Or would she still insist on due process of law, urging others to be patient as human beings were sold into slavery or the Nazis carted people off to Dachau? Is it fair for a person whose complicity in the status quo is rewarded with financial stability and social status to accuse someone who has risked everything to abide by his conscience of cowardice? Perhaps Aiken would also feel entitled to inform John Brown that he was a coward, or the Germans who attempted to assassinate Hitler. Once this question is asked, another question inexorably follows: what qualifies as a situation that calls for action to be taken outside the established channels of the legal system, if not the current ecological crisis? Species are going extinct all over the planet, climate change is beginning to wreak serious havoc on human beings as well, and scientists are giving us a very short window of time to turn our act around, while the US government and its corporate puppeteers refuse to make even the insufficient changes called for by liberals. If the dystopian nightmare those scientists predict comes to pass, will the refugees of the future look back at this encounter between McGowan and Aiken and judge McGowan the coward? We live in a democracy, Aiken and her kind insist. Bypassing the established channels and breaking the law is akin to attacking freedom, community, and dialogue themselves. That's the same thing they said in 1859. Those who consider obeying the law more important than abiding by one's conscience always try to frame themselves as the responsible ones, but the essence of that attitude is the desire to evade responsibility. Society, as represented however badly by its entrenched institutions, is responsible for decreeing right and wrong. All one must do is brainlessly comply, arguing for a change when the results are not to one's taste but never stepping out of line. That is the creed of cowards, if anything is. At the hearing to determine whether the defendants should be sentenced as terrorists, Aiken acknowledged with frustration that she had no control over what the Bureau of Prisons would do with them regardless of her recommendations, but washed her hands of the matter and gave McGowan and others terrorism enhancements anyway. Doubtless, Aiken feels that whatever shortcomings the system has are not her responsibility, even if she participates in forcing them on others. She's just doing her job. That's the Nuremberg defense. Regardless of what she thinks of McGowan's actions or the Bureau of Prisons, Aiken is personally responsible for sending him to prison. She is responsible for separating him from his wife, for preventing him from continuing his work supporting survivors of domestic violence. If he is beaten or raped while in prison, it is the same as if Aiken beat or raped him. And not just McGowan, or Paul, or Sadie or Exile, but every single person Aiken has ever sent to prison. But Aiken and her kind are responsible for a lot more than this. As the polar ice caps melt, rainforests are reduced to pulp, and climate change inflicts more and more terrible catastrophes around the planet, they are responsible for stopping all who would take direct action to avert these tragedies. They are responsible, in short, for forcing the wholesale destruction of the natural environment upon everyone else on Earth. Aiken might counter that the so-called democratic system is the most effective way to go about halting that destruction. It sure has worked so far, hasn't it? On the contrary, it seems more likely that she cannot bring herself to honestly consider whether there could be a higher good than the maintenance of law and order. For people like her, obedience to the law is more precious than polar ice caps, rainforests, and cities like New Orleans. Any price is worth paying to avoid taking responsibility for their part in determining the fate of the planet. Talk about cowardice! So if McGowan and the other non-cooperating Green Scare defendants are not cowards, does that mean they are heroes? We should be cautious not to unthinkingly adopt the inverse of Aiken's judgment. In presenting the case for the government, Pfeiffer described the Operation Backfire defendants' exploits as almost like Mission Impossible. It serves the powers that be to present the defendants as superhuman the more exceptional their deeds seem to be, the further out of reach such deeds will feel to everyone else. Similarly, Leonizing heroes can be a way for the rest of us to let ourselves off the hook, as we are obviously not heroes of their caliber. We need not hold ourselves up to the same standards of conduct. It is a disservice to glorify McGowan, Exile, Sadie, Peter Young, and others like them. In choosing anonymous action, they did not set out to be celebrated, but to privately do what they thought was necessary, just as all of us ought to. They are as normal as any of us. Any normal person who takes responsibility for his or her actions is capable of tremendous things. This is not to say we should all become arsonists. There are countless paths available to those who would take responsibility for themselves, and each person must choose the one that is most appropriate to his or her situation. Let the courage of the non-cooperating Green Scare defendants, who dared to act on their beliefs and refused to betray those convictions even when threatened with life in prison, serve as reminders of just how much normal people like us can accomplish.